Welcome to the Unhurried Living Podcast. We're sharing leadership conversations to help you develop unhurried rhythms of rest and work. We're helping you overcome hurry and make time for what matters most. And now, enjoy today's episode. Hey friends, welcome to episode 259 of the podcast. My name's Alan and I'm so glad you've joined me here. I'm hopeful that our time together will help you rediscover an unhurried way of life and leadership. Now, I've shared often that one of the unexpected unhurriers of my life has been suffering. And much of that suffering has been more a suffering of soul than physical pain. Anxiety and depression have too often been familiar companions throughout my life. And it's for that reason that I'm glad to have a chance to speak with Alan Noble about his recently released book on getting out of bed, The Burden and Gift of Living. In it, he shares his own journey with inner suffering like anxiety and depression, and he offers us a vision of how we might discover the grace of God right in the middle of all that. I'm hopeful that you'll find grace for the hard places in your own soul's journey. Alan Noble is Associate Professor of English at Oklahoma Baptist University, co-founder and editor-in-chief of Christ and Pop Culture, and an advisor for the AND campaign. He has written for The Atlantic, Vox, BuzzFeed, the Gospel Coalition, Christianity Today, and First Things. He is also the author of Disruptive Witness and You Are Not Your Own. Now, if you're a new listener, welcome to the podcast. If you find these episodes helpful, would you please follow, rate, and review? And please be sure to share this podcast with your friends. Meanwhile, let's dive into my conversation with Alan Noble. On today's Unhurried Living podcast, I'm pleased to have Alan Noble, author of On Getting Out of Bed. Thank you, Alan, for joining me for this conversation.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I've been looking forward to the chance to talk about your book. And as we begin, I wonder, could I ask you to just share maybe some of the story of how this particular book came to be?
Sure. Yeah. In many ways, it's the culmination of my previous two books. My first book, Disruptive Witness, focused on technology of distraction and secularization, which both make it difficult to share the gospel. And in that book, I talk about the way we distract ourselves from ourselves in order to avoid the reality of sin and despair within us. And that's primarily how I talked about the way we distract ourselves. And I went around the country talking about that. And it struck me as I was giving talks on the book that that's not the only reason we distract ourselves. Yeah. A lot of people distract themselves because life is really hard and they need a coping mechanism. And that's, the phone, Netflix, whatever it is the easiest coping mechanism, but especially the phone and social media. And, so out of that came my second book, You Are Not Your Own. And in that, I talk about the sociological forces that make living in the modern world so difficult, that make living in the modern world an inhuman experience. And I really talk about the way the modern world assumes that we are each our own and we belong to ourselves. But if that's not true, if we belong to God, then we're going to naturally live in this tension, in this conflict. And that tension, that conflict is going to cause anxiety, despair, depression, all these sorts of things. And then we're going to turn to technology of distraction to cope. So I kind of developed a more nuanced reading of this phenomena of distracting ourselves. And then in this book, I take it a step further and but also narrow it down. And instead of asking the sociological question, why is there a mental health crisis? Because there is a mental health crisis in our country. I sort of asked the question, what are we to do about this crisis? What are we to do about it as individuals day to day, not as a society? How do we fix this big problem? But what does it look like to live with the reality of a mental health crisis? And part of this came out of my experience working with students. Part of it came out of my own story. Part of it came out of just knowing people and realizing that a lot of people suffer in a lot of ways, and they often don't share that. And so I wanted a book that normalized suffering.
Wow. Well, I tell you, I really found a lot to resonate with personally, as I read the book. And as you begin the book, one of the things you talk about is our habit, many of us anyway, at times of assuming that other people's suffering it's their fault, or if they just did this, they could fix it, or and you sort of say, it's easy to think like Job's friends.
Yeah.
Can you say more about that tendency we have as we deal with suffering?
I think this is a particular problem for evangelical Christians living in a secular world where we are hyper aware that people are looking at us, they're watching us, they want to see how we are different. And so we want to be different, and we want to be different in positive ways. We want to be different in positive ways. And so one of those ways is joyfulness, contentment, peace, flourishing, affluence, success, positivity, all these positive attributes that we associate with the good life. That's not what the Bible associates with the good life. The Bible is much more nuanced than that, but it's what we tend to associate. And so I think what that does is it makes us think, well, when somebody's suffering, it's because they're not good enough Christians, or they're not Christian at all, or they've chosen their suffering. And when we experience suffering, our tendency, our temptation is going to be to hide that, to shield it, to keep it to ourselves, because we don't want other people to know. We don't want to do bad, give a bad impression about the church. We want the church to seem like this place where you come in and you get transformed, and now you're well and whole. And in a sense, that is absolutely true. There is a peace, there is a shalom that you get from being a child, recognizing that you are a child of God and belonging to Christ's family. But we also know from Scripture, Paul's got a thorn in his side. I mean, the church has long understood that suffering and persecution is a normal part of the Christian experience. It's really just the modern world that has created this false impression that you've got to be, superficially happy in order to be a good Christian.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. So I think one of the ways you describe that dynamic and how we respond to it, this modern cultural reality, is that, there's always this promise of a technique or a quick fix or a hack. If only you just did this quick thing, wow, you'll just overcome any challenge and you'll put it behind you and off you go. Can you say more about that common cultural assumption?
Yeah. So I'm taking this from a French Christian philosopher named Jacques Ellul, who argues that technique is what marks our modern age. And I deal with it a lot in my book, You Are Not Your Own. And a technique is any method for maximizing efficiency. And Ellul argues that technique creeps into every single aspect of our lives. And what it does is it says the most efficient method for doing something has got to be the best method for doing something. And the illusion of technique is that all we need to do to solve our problems is find the right technique. Whatever problem you have, technique can solve it. Technique becomes a savior. And so you see gurus on social media promising to help fix your small business or your marriage or your parenting or your weight or whatever, your spiritual life, whatever it is. right? Promising to make you a better preacher, promising to improve your goals in life, to, your fitness. Every single aspect of your life, there's someone offering a technique. And it gives, again, this illusion that really there's always a way to overcome a problem. That's the modern world that we live in. There's always a method or a strategy. And if you've still got a problem after trying to fix it, then either you didn't try hard enough or you used the wrong technique. So you need to keep looking for another self-help guru, or a guide or a YouTube video to help you fix it, or you should have tried harder, and it's your fault. So either way, it's your fault. Right. But and I think that creates an additional layer of anxiety and distress in the modern world. We have a lot of benefits of living in the modern world. I love, indoor plumbing, for example. Electricity is fantastic, but it does create unique anxieties. And this is something scholars have noted for, 100+ years. And those anxieties have to be analyzed and addressed and dealt with.
Yeah. And there seems to be this sense that really we ought to be in complete control of everything, our emotions, our situations, our initiatives, our work, whatever. And when we're not able to, my experience is that creates an immense amount of anxiety.
Right. Yeah. No, we want to, we want to be constantly in control. And the world is fundamentally uncontrollable. I mean, this is what we believe about from our perspective, from a human perspective. The world is outside of our control. It's in God's control, not ours. And there's a great peace and relief to be had there. But in the constant striving to master and control your world, there is only anxiety, depression, frustration, feelings of inadequacy, and more struggle.
Well, yeah. So this is the Unhurried Living podcast, and we talk about some of these themes. And one of the intersections I noticed you talk about, to avoid or to distract ourselves from the problem of our inner pain or from the question of what really matters. A lot of us just get busy. Yeah. And we fill our lives with more and more and more busy, and we stay hurried so we don't have to engage the question. Can you say more about your perspective on that dynamic?
Yeah. And I think I've gone back and forth on this. So there are a couple of things I would say. One, I would say, you are in a healthy place of flourishing if you can be alone with yourself for an extended period of time without mental distress. I think that's a goal. At the same time, I think that there are periods in life when you can be so tempted by anxiety and worry and obsessions and dread that staying busy with meaningful activities that are God glorifying and honoring and loving to other people is a good way of channeling your energy towards something that is meaningful, as opposed to allowing yourself to get lost in your thoughts. And so it's there's an interesting dynamic. I think that some of us have to move through a period where we actually are tempted to not be busy, or to be busy with trivial things. We want to be not busy so that we can be anxious and worried about a great many things, or we want to be busy with trivial things so that we don't have to think about things. And then we have to journey through a period where we stay busy, but we very consciously choose to put things in our lives that are meaningful, good, true, and beautiful And it's, I would not describe it, as hurried living or harried living. It's a full life, but it's not just filling your life with stuff, right? Yeah. And then I think the ideal is to come out on the other side where you're able to choose meaningful things to do, but then also have the freedom to do nothing at all, to sit, to enjoy a sunset, and to not be plagued with anxious thoughts. But that can be, for some of us, that's a process that we have to get to. In my non-medical professional experience.
Yeah, I appreciate your way of sort of describing, I guess you could call it attention. I guess you could call it a rhythm. The capacity to be alone, to be silent, and to, to sense that you're in the graced presence of God in that. Or also to be able to do the next thing you talk about. To simply see a good opportunity and, to use your book title, to get out of bed, to take a step, to do the next thing, and to let good things sort of occupy your time.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think we have to do the next thing, take a step towards the block, to quote T.S. Eliot, and choose to do the next right thing. So being careful about what we're doing and what's wise and what's prudent, but still choosing to act in the world. But boy, it's great to be in the place where you can have what Joseph Pieper calls leisure, where you're just accepting that God is the one in control of the universe, not you, and you can rest, and you can just rest. That's a place that we should all be working toward in our spiritual disciplines.
Yeah, I really appreciate that affirmation. So in continuing to read through your book, one of your pieces of counsel is that in our experiences of inner hardship, we need to learn to ask for help. But I'd say a lot of us sort of assume that needing help is some sign of personal failure.
Yeah.
I should be able to do this myself. It seems a lot of us are saying to ourselves.
Yeah, I think we live in a hyper-competitive society. This is, again, not to go back to my second book, but as I said in the introduction, so much of the sociology behind this current book on getting out of bed is captured in my second book, You Are Not Your Own. So if we start from the premise that we are our own and we belong to ourselves, that means that we have the obligation to make our lives interesting and meaningful and exciting and enviable and good branding and positive public image and all these sorts of things. And that puts a tremendous burden on us to perform and to act and to try to be somebody. And weakness is public, any kind of even semi-public, like asking a friend for help. Weakness can feel like admitting that you can't compete. You can't keep up. You're not good enough.
Yeah.
And that's not, it's not just saying I'm vulnerable. It's saying I'm vulnerable and I'm in the arena where everybody who's vulnerable is getting hunted, and I'm not going to be able to stand it. And that's a terrifying thing. But what I think we have to keep in mind is that basically everybody else around us feels the same way. Everybody else around us is thinking, I wish I had someone to talk to. I'm so alone. I wish I had someone to talk to. They're just not saying it out loud. They might not be able to admit it, but they're saying it. They're feeling it. They're thinking it. And so often what is required is this place of humility that sometimes can only come when you are broken,
Yes.
where you have to say, I can't do this alone. I can't do this alone. I need help. And there's something really beautiful that happens there when other people have the opportunity to minister to you, because what can happen is that opens up the possibility of them sharing as well. Now they've seen, oh, it's possible to allow others to bear my burdens. I think I'm going to do that too. And then it can start kind of an avalanche of confessing. And so, and sharing and bearing each other's burdens. So it's a beautiful thing.
I really love that vision. I think for me in my own journey, part of it has been realizing, that whole game is rigged. And I don't actually have to be in the middle of it. I can choose to if I want, but I might find, and it's been my brokenness, it's been my own inner suffering that's helped me realize, well, maybe not being able to excel at that game is not the worst thing about me.
Yeah.
Maybe actually my best contribution doesn't even involve that game. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe it looks like subtle interactions with your children or with a friend or ministering to a neighbor or, doing some little act of kindness and grace and mercy. Even though the world doesn't recognize those things as the great things, even though it doesn't, it wants us to think in terms of activities and actions that are much more marketable. And that's really the key. And I will say, this idea of bearing each other's burdens and opening up to others, it doesn't always turn out well. And you've got to be ready for that too, right?
That's true.
We talked earlier about Job's friends, about all of our tendencies to be Job's friends. Well, if you share your burdens with others, eventually you're going to find a Job's friend. You're going to find someone who says, but the Christian life is a happy life. Right. And so if you're depressed, then you're in sin in some way and you need to repent and feel God's peace. Just feel God's peace. That's it. As if you could just snap your fingers and feel better when you're experiencing mental affliction. So I guess my counsel there, my advice, my suggestion would be to not grow weary of doing what is good. So it's good to share. It's good to allow others to bear your burdens. So even when you get burned, even when you get hurt by someone, dust yourself off and find someone else. Don't stop, because we need one another. And there are some people who are not spiritually, emotionally, psychologically wise and mature enough to help you. And that's okay. You just got to keep looking for those who can help you.
Yeah, that's a good thing. Well, I think of some of my own historical journey with anxiety, with depression, where there were seasons where anxiety was utterly paralyzing, or where depression was just a dark pit I couldn't imagine ever getting out of. And that's not to say all things are rosy now, but there have been some particularly hard seasons. And one of the hard things for me has been in those moments to affirm the goodness of God when I feel so bad. So can you talk a little bit about how we might find our way to trusting in the grace of God when our lives don't feel very graced?
So one of the tensions that I think we have is between our subjective experience of anxiety, depression, despair, frustration, fear, whatever it might be, and the objective reality that we are a loved, cherished, beautiful creation of a loving God. And that tension, that reality is an important reality to keep in mind. On the one hand, what we don't want to say is, well, the subjective part is just wrong, so stop feeling that. which is, hey, look, if you can just stop feeling wrong things, then stop feeling wrong things. More
by
power
all
to
means.
you. That's by all means. That's wonderful for you. But for the rest of us, that doesn't work. And so we have to begin by acknowledging those feelings. Okay, so I don't feel God's presence right now. Okay, so I don't feel that my life has purpose or meaning right now. Okay, all right. That's a real experience. That's a real feeling. That's what I'm experiencing right now. But then we have to have, in my experience, we have to have outside voices who are able to reorient us towards the truth, and this goes back to community, who are able to say to us, Alan, I know that you're feeling despair right now. You're feeling a sense of hopelessness, as you were saying earlier, where you're in this pit and it doesn't look like you're ever going to get out. But you will be healed. Maybe not in this life, but you will be healed. God does love you. You are cherished. You are forgiven. You are not condemned. You've been forgiven by Christ's work on the cross, and that's objective. So take heart. And I think what taking heart there means is not change your heart's emotions, change your heart's thoughts, but instead reorient your behavior. So often our emotions, in my experience, follow our behavior. So it may not look like, after a conversation with a friend like that, I may still feel miserable, but my task, my duty is to act on the objective truth that he has shared with me. So that looks like often getting out of bed, going downstairs, being with my family, being present. And I can take my suffering with me. I can take my suffering with me, but I can take my anxiety with me. But what I'm doing is I'm enacting the objective truth. The objective truth is there, and I'm living it out by choosing to be present in my life, the life that God has given me and called me to. And yeah.
I really appreciate that. I remember I had a counselor who did me a lot of good, was a good friend as well as a good voice. And one of the things he would often say is, Alan, you're going to have to take your anxiety with you.
Yeah.
You can't wait till it goes away and then go do something. You're going to have to take it with you and do the good things that you feel God's called you to do. You're going to have to take your depression with you. You might not want it sitting at in the driver's seat. You might want it in the back seat, but you're going to have to take it with you because you can't leave it behind. I don't know how to tell you how to do that.
Yeah. That's a hard word to receive, isn't it?
It really is.
It's a hard word because just the nature of anxiety and depression is you want it to go away. You want it to end. You want it to stop. It's, especially anxiety, which is this alarm. It's an alarm going. I always think of anxiety as a car alarm going off, right? And so it's telling you emergency, 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 and you're like, well, what's the emergency? Right. And maybe you've imagined something, or whatever it might be, but when you have to take your anxiety with you, that's so hard to do because you have been trained your whole life to pay attention to car alarms, the car alarm of your mind going off. Your whole life, you've been trained to do this. And now you have a therapist telling you, actually, your alarm is malfunctioning and you're going to have to trust me. And you're just going to have to go on with your day. Allow the alarm to go off. Don't try to fix it. Don't try to correct it. Don't just allow it to go off. And that is so counterintuitive, but it's for some of us at least. Again, I'm not a mental health professional, but for some of us at least, that's what we need to do. We need to take our anxiety with us.
There was a season where in ministry we had a lot of old cars that sort of worked and sometimes sort of didn't. And one of them had a check engine light. So we took it to our mechanic and he looked it over and he ran all the diagnostics and he came back and he said, well, I can tell you what's wrong. The car's running okay, your computer seems to be wrong. Now, fixing that would cost more than your car cost. So here's my counsel. Learn to live with the check engine light on. And just trust me, this car's okay. It's going to run fine. Just get used to that. And that became this sort of metaphor. For me, it's like, yeah, the car alarm's going off. Yeah, that light is red. But I've talked to some trustworthy people, and I think I'm okay.
Wow. I'm going to remember that. That's beautiful.
That helped me immensely. I mean, that was such a gift. And that's not to say I always do it. Still, I will see the light come on and, oh no, something terrible. But if I think a little bit, if I remember, that's been a word of grace for me a lot of times.
Isn't that lovely? The way God gives that to us.
I was so grateful. Well, one of the very simple sentences you wrote that I found a lot of grace in, you just said the decision to get out of bed is the decision to live. I wonder if you could just unpack that very simple, I think deceptively simple sentence.
So, at the heart of this book is this theory that all of us at one point or another are going to face some kind of mental affliction that is going to cause us to question whether life is worth living. And I wanted to expand on two concepts. One is mental affliction, and one is whether life is worth living. So mental affliction, I chose that term because it encompasses both diagnosed and undiagnosed and undiagnosable, not both, all three categories of mental distress. Because there's some people who don't have a mental illness, but they experience a life trauma or a life challenge, or they're mourning, or it could be any number of things that just knock them down, knock them flat. And one of my concerns about the language of mental health and self-care is that, which are valid and valuable. But I think if we use that language too much, and if we don't use it carefully, what it can convey is there are official, legitimate mental afflictions, and then there are unofficial, illegitimate ones. And my theory is, look, all of us at some point, there's a kind of leveling that happens. At some point, we're all going to hit this. Some of us live in that space. Some of us just have a little pit stop, but you're going to come to this point. And when you do, you're going to have an answer to the question, why live? Why get out of bed? And so with that second part, the part you asked a question about, why get out of bed, which is fundamentally the question, why live? It seemed to me that when we talk about suicide and giving up on life, we tend to think just in the one extreme, which is suicide. We think one, but there are lots of ways of giving up on life that don't involve ending your life immediately, right? So, for example, right now in the United States, among middle-aged men without college degrees, there's a decline in life expectancy due to what are referred to as deaths of despair. And those include suicides, alcohol and drug overdoses, alcohol-related deaths and drug overdoses. And there's a great book by two economists on this called Deaths of Despair. And they argue that all three are forms of suicide. It's just that alcoholism is a slow form of suicide, and drug addiction is a slow form of suicide. And when you start to frame it that way, you realize, oh gosh, there are actually lots of ways to do this. Like in the modern world, I could work a job, a very menial job, give up on having friendships, devote my life to pornography and video games and drugs, and just numb myself until I die. Right? I mean, that's a form of giving up on life. There's so many ways of just saying life is unbearable. I'm out. And some of those ways involve ending your life immediately, but some of them just mean giving up on your life slowly. And so to me, the image of getting out of bed is the image of waking up to a new dawn and embracing the day, embracing creation and the opportunities that God has given you. And that's not always easy to do, but I think it's a good metaphor for the choice to live, which looks, for the person who's slowly killing themselves with alcohol, it's the choice to put the bottle down, right? And for the person who feels that they can't live a flourishing life, so they're just numbing themselves with pornography and drugs and whatever, scrolling on TikTok, it's putting the device down and getting up and doing something. So yeah,
that's really powerful. You're right. Suicide, we usually think of the crisis moment of someone's physical death, but there's so many ways to die in our souls, to give up relationally, to give up vocationally, It seems to me that that's been a place where the biblical language of hope has helped. Not hope as like a buoyant feeling in the moment, but more hope like, actually, God has good things ahead of me. Maybe even in this next step I'm going to take. I wonder if I could experiment with taking that step and seeing if there's good there when I get there.
This is one of the reasons why I used Cormac McCarthy's The Road, his novel, The Road, throughout this book, because I think that novel captures that sense of hope. For listeners who haven't, I won't spoil it, but for listeners who haven't read it, it's a post-apocalyptic world where there's just a father and son and roaming bands of cannibals, and they're just trying to stay alive. And the sun has been blocked out by this cloud of dust and ash. So nothing is growing. So there doesn't seem to be any hope for a future civilization.
Yeah.
And so what we would say is experiential and materialist hope are gone. Experience says life is hopeless. Material evidence says life is hopeless. And yet the father and son choose to go down the road together anyway. They choose to live. They could end their lives, but they choose to live anyway. And there's a line near the end where the father looks at his son who's walked ahead on the road. And it says something like, he looked back at him from some unimaginable future, which is a fascinating line, because any future is by definition imaginable. If you could think about a future, it's imaginable, right? If you think about tomorrow, you've imagined it. So what does it mean to be an unimaginable future? Well, I think what McCarthy's trying to get at is that the father couldn't imagine a future where his son's life would be flourishing and happy and content and prosperous and successful, all the things that we desire for our children. But he hoped anyway. He saw a future anyway. And it says actually glowing in that waste like a tabernacle. So he was like a tabernacle, a sign of God's presence in the world. And so, I think you're exactly right. That's the kind of hope that we have to have. It's not a hope it's sometimes a hope we feel.
Sure.
And that's great when that happens, but it's a hope that we live. It's a hope that we, enact. There's another line from that novel where the boy asks his father, "What's the hardest thing you ever did?" And the father says, "Get out of bed this morning." And that's that hope lived out. And there are some mornings like that. And that's okay.
That's exactly right. Well, it makes me think, to expand the language, the theological triad of faith and hope and love.
Yeah.
All of those invite us to something in the next good thing.
Yeah.
We trust in perhaps goodness we've tasted before, that maybe we can trust that goodness will be before us again. We hope and we enter into the divine initiative of care that is available to us. We may not feel it. We may feel our emotional reality precludes the possibility of it.
Yeah.
But as you say, we still get out of bed and we take some step.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things, as you talked in your chapter about do the next thing, I've sometimes sort of expanded that mentally in a way that doesn't help me, which is do the next perfect thing.
Yeah.
Especially when I'm depressed or especially when I'm anxious. Like I create this impossible next step for myself.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out what the next perfect thing is. Can you differentiate how just do the next thing is different than that do the next perfect thing?
Yeah. Yeah. So if you do the next perfect thing, you'll never act. You'll be frozen. And you've probably experienced that. I've certainly experienced that myself. And the next thing is just the next right step that honors God. And we don't agonize about it. We don't stress about it. We just take a step of faith, believing that this is at the moment what we understand to be the right step, the right thing for us to do, whether that's making a meal for our family or putting our kids to bed or doing the dishes or shopping or writing a book or writing a sermon or whatever it might be, helping a neighbor. We just look at the next thing that we have to do and then we do it. You're right. If your standard is the next perfect thing, then you'll be frozen with feelings of inadequacy. You'll feel like whatever you do will be insufficient and will pale in comparison to what the standard really is. But the standard is that we worship God with our bodies by acting. And so that's what we are called to do.
Well, I've really appreciated the chance to interact about what you've written here. And I wonder if we could close, if I could ask you maybe just to share a word of grace to our listeners, whether they find themselves in a present place of, depression or anxiety or some other kind of mental suffering, or whether perhaps the listener has someone in their life who is in such a place. Could you just share a word of grace to close?
Yeah, I would say you are the child of God. You are a child of God. You are loved. You are created and sustained moment by moment by a God who cares for you and knows you intimately. He knows your affliction. He knows your anxiety. He knows your fears better than you do. And he chooses to love you still. And so your task is to accept that love, even when it feels unacceptable because you feel unworthy, even when it feels unacceptable because you have doubts about God or about yourself. Your task is to trust other trustworthy people, believe them, believe the truth that God loves you, and act on that truth by loving others. And when you do that, you are worshiping God.
Well, that is a very good invitation. And again, my guest today has been Alan Noble, and we've been talking about his book, On Getting Out of Bed. Alan, it's been a real pleasure to talk with you today.
Yeah, it's been wonderful. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed our conversation as much as I did. It's hard to believe that we've reached the end of this season. The podcast will be taking a break over the summer, and we'll start back up on September 4th. Our first guest of the new season will be Os Guinness, and we'll be talking about his book, The Great Quest. I look forward to sharing that conversation with you in the fall. During the summer break, I encourage you to explore our library of episodes. There are some really good ones back there among the more than 250 we've produced since we began a number of years ago. Now, if you'd like to receive more help from Unhurried Living, I invite you to join our Unhurried Daily email list. For 40 days, we'll send you a brief daily email that offers personal reflections from life and Scripture to help you take the next step in following Jesus' unhurried way. You can sign up on our website at unhurriedliving.com. We're honored to encourage thousands of leaders just like you. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to the Unhurried Living podcast. Join us next time to learn more about following the genius of Jesus' unhurried way of life and leadership.